Hello, welcome into Supernatural History. I'm Chris. I think we've got a great video here today on Lilith. It's something that maybe I had a lot of preconceptions about before I really started digging deep into the research on Lilith. I actually did, and some of those preconceptions were really dispelled. And I think at the end of the video, you'll feel the same. You maybe had some preconceived ideas about what Lilith is, where she came from, and maybe you heard the sort of folklore that maybe she was Adam's first wife. If you want to describe it as folklore, maybe you take it as just that, but we'll put a definitely different spin on the whole story. I think you'll come away enlightened and have a better overall view to be able to make your own determination. But in many ways, I think this whole Lilith story, when I look back and see the way it changed over many centuries, in fact, many scholars that cover what they call Abrahamic mythology, they regard her as the first mythological figure ever known. So she's the oldest being that we have any record of. And we'll get into that in just a bit, but it's interesting. And in many ways, when you track the evolution of Lilith over all these centuries, it almost, to me, seems like, and maybe you'll agree at the end, but almost like a centuries-long game of telephone, that the story changes over time. And you may feel that way here. And in many ways, it also reminds me a bit of the poem from the 1800s from Hans Christian Andersen, I think it was, The Emperor Has No Clothes. So there's a little bit of that effect. Maybe you'll agree with that, maybe you won't, but hear me out and let's wait till the end. And I think you'll be at a different conclusion than where we started in most cases. I know I have been. It's great fun. It adds even more context, I think, to a lot of sort of a surface level knowledge of it to some degree, or just you're cognizant of them, but some of these may have more credence to them, may have more light on them after this. So let's get into Lilith and how did she come to be, and where did she start, and then what changed for her over the centuries, and how did she end up where she is today, which is vastly different, as you'll see, from where she started. But when you look back at where she is today, many people, they think maybe she was they know about the Babylonian part. Some people do, that she was considered more of the evil figure, and really she was known as a baby stealer, and women had to ward her off. And then by today's measure, she's held in much higher regard, it seems. But so she's either sort of the Babylonian imagery in many cases, or in many ways today she's more the sort of an ultimate taboo when you look at the story of being Adam's first wife, if you take that part of it, and then how that translates into being sort of the ultimate feminist. But we'll look into all that and where she truly came from, and then the oldest historical allusions to her. But when we look back, in the beginning, we go back to Mesopotamia, back many thousands of years ago. And I said she's thought to be the first known mythological figure. And when we look back in those times, human beings, they really feared the wild, sort of unpredictable forces of nature, and she was considered to be one of those forces. She wasn't necessarily in the beginning, and when you look back, there was another sort of architectural sister of hers called Lamashtu, but she had more of a specific purpose. But in the beginning, it seems, and you can gather this a lot from, there's some artifacts that have been discovered, one being an incantation bowl that dates all the way back to Samaria, where they went through these incantations to ward Lilith off, to keep her at bay. But she was more of a class of entities, whereas the Lamashtu had more of a specific role. The Lilith were these class beings that sort of assisted Lamashtu with the same sort of aim in mind. And they were called, back then they were called Lilitu, or also known as Ardat Lili. And they were known to be spirits of the wind, spirits of dust storms, and of spiritual barrenness. But the most likely known depiction of Lilith at that time is carbon dated to 1800, roughly 1800 BC, and it's also known as the Burney relief, but also I think translated into Queen of the Night. But it depicts a naked winged goddess, and she has bird talons for feet, and that she's standing atop two lions and flanked by owls. And we'll get into the sort of the owl illusions, but there's a connection to owls. And it's like I said, it's about 1800 BC. And then So that's one of the discoveries of Lilith that we ever had. And then when you look at Lamashtu, as I mentioned, she's depicted as having a lion's head, donkey teeth, and long bird-like talons, and then a hairy body like an Esau figure from the Bible. Lamashtu, she was considered a rejected goddess. She targets vulnerable members of society, and she can slip through the door, she can make her way through a roof, any opening, and she really wreaked terror on the women of that time. And she could, they say, and the legend has it, that she could cause a spontaneous abortion by tapping on a woman's belly 7 times. One story that's endured over time. And then she would even steal newborns. She was known to kidnap and take newborns right from their mothers. So the mothers not only had to worry about getting through their pregnancy, but they had to worry about, is Lamashtu going to show up and take my baby? So these, as I mentioned, those incantation bowls, and then we'll see it develops more into amulets that were worn. But all of these were worn to sort of ward off these evil child-stealing, child-killing spirits. And then while Lamashtu, she was taking the children, as I said, this class of spirits called Lilith and also Lily, they provided more of the night terror aspect. It's just as helpers, as sort of that unknown, destructive wilderness force out there. And it said it just perpetuated this fear of wild beasts, but of forest, of the sea, these places where wild animals reigned. And so in Lily, it actually means a maiden to marriageable age, which is part of the story as well, is that they think the Lily was the ghost of a young woman who died unmarried and unfulfilled in Lamashtu, and that she was wreaking havoc. She was exacting her revenge on human mothers over time. And so you had the Lily that were kind of trapped between 2 worlds, but the real world, and they became ghosts. And then also, even in that time, they were documented, they think, to be what they call a succubus, or a ghost that would come into the room of a young man and sometimes take that young man's energy, his life energy. And it was even a superstition at the time. They thought if a man had a nocturnal emission, that there was a chance he had been visited during the night and didn't even know it by one of these 2 night demons. And so, but over the centuries, and this is where the telephone part starts to come into play, but Lamashtu and Lilith sort of fused together, and they sort of became one being, where Lilith is the being who's actually taking the babies and destroying the babies, as well as kidnapping them and exacting that night terror also. So from that point on, she sort of became the central figure, and Lamashtu sort of faded into the night, so to speak. But they were so terrified of this infant stealing archetype that they, as I mentioned, they had the incantation bowls, and they wore these amulets. And the amulets there was another demonic force known as Pazazu, who was supposed to be the antithesis of Lilith, but could counter Lilith. And they wore this Pazazu amulet. And interestingly enough, as a sidebar, there was a movie in the 1970s in America called The Exorcist. It was probably one of the highest grossing horror films ever. But this girl, she was occupied, she was by Pazazu. And so Pazazu was he was not a friendly demon. He kind of got a bad rap a little bit in The Exorcist, but his role kind of changed. He became a terror-filled demon in that movie. But originally Pazazu was the most good force among the demons that would ward away Lilith and keep your baby safe. We got through, and all through that time, and even up until, you would say, many centuries before Jesus came, in the centuries, they especially note that probably around the writing of Isaiah, around that time, that this sort of seeped into Jewish writers' documentation, that their accounts, that it seeped into their culture to some degree. This whole notion of Lilith, everything she represented. And we'll get into that a little bit, how that manifests in the Bible. And it kind of, because the only mention of Lilith throughout the entire Bible is shaky at best and really gives us no clarity, but it's Isaiah 34:14. And in the King James it reads, "The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow, the screech owl shall also rest and find for herself a place of rest." So in the KJV, it seems that screech owl is substituted for Lilith in other translations. In fact, the RSV says it differently. They call her a night hag, an endearing term. And then the NASB says night monster. And then you got all the other ones, a lot of the other ones, the NSRV, the LEB, the JPS, the JB, the NJB, they all use Lilith. And I think there's, in the original Hebrew Masoretic text, the word is Lilith, Lilit. And in even the NIV, it has a footnote stating that it could be considered Lilith. So it almost seems they're talking about, and we'll get into that, the meaning of that passage, because it's what they call a desolation passage. And that gives some light and some clarity to the passage as well. But maybe they were referring in Lilith to the whole class of beings, or maybe they were confining it to this one figure who had evolved. But when you look at the etymology of the word in Babylonian and Assyrian, it does come from wind or storm, as I mentioned. And in Akkadian Hebrew, it's Lalil, which in Lalel is also the Hebrew word for night. So they kind of morphed into night demon of sorts, but and in many ways, maybe they're just describing a night demon, a night force, or maybe it's just wild, unclean animals that were out in the wilderness that they didn't really want to get anywhere near. But it's a larger passage, that Isaiah 34:14, about a prophecy against the nation of Edom, descendants from Esau. That's God is going to judge Edom, and he's going to make that entire, and it's happened throughout Scripture when he prophesies in this way that they're going to be absolute desolate. They're going to be nothing there but wild animals that rule, and that's going to be the worst of judgments, because Edom at that time was flying high. They were doing well as a civilization, as a society, and this was going to be God's declaration that everything will be turned to dust and everything will be given to the wild animals. And so it forms that passage. So it's really all that's there in the Bible is that one passage, and so it's hard to really, you can't really take anything from that other than maybe they I would say referring to that class, or maybe even that single mythological figure from Babylonian times. And maybe it was just a representation of sorts, that it was a representation of wild, unclean animals. And again, there's an allusion to the owl there. So, and that persisted, as I mentioned, that Burney relief, that clay depiction we have, the oldest of Lilith with the owls right next to her. So there is some connection to the owl. Owl's obviously a night creature, it's nocturnal, so maybe that's the extent of the connection. We probably will never know about that. But, and then when you look at it further from the Bible, we're going to get into where this emanated from, but there has been the controversy that it's not certainly traditional church dogma, that in Genesis there were, and we talked about this in the last video on the Mark of Cain, actually two creations, the creation of Genesis 1:27, and then the other creation of just Adam in Genesis 2, and then from there his helpmeet and Eve. But as I said, it drew at times, because that was more of the prevailing thought, is the first creation was everyone, they were both made from the same material. So how can it be that Eve was formed from his rib? And how can that be? And we'll get into a little bit of how this whole notion of Adam's first wife and Lilith, but that sort of dual creation controversy kind of made it a passageway into this Adam as his first wife being Lilith. So we'll get to that. And many people say that they speculate that if Lilith was the first wife, that she was contentious, she was made from the same material, so she had too much of a mind of her own. She wasn't really made as a helpmeet, as it specifically says that Eve will be a helpmeet. And it even says that some people speculate that Eve being taken from Adam in what is a very from the rib, which is, it's a covered bone and it's an inward organic connection, it's more modest, that is more of what Adam needed. That's, as he said in Genesis, she is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, that made for a better mate for Adam. And we'll get to that Lilith was too contentious, too much of a mind her own, and she was going her own way, which she will do, as we'll discover. And then, so really until the Middle Ages, there wasn't much of anything said in any text that we know about, that any mention of a Lilith character or Lilith beings. But things really started, they took another leg and they sort of evolved for Lilith around, they think, 1000 AD with this, what's called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. It was an anonymous author, a pseudepigraphal work, but it was probably emanated from the Byzantine Empire. I think maybe around Baghdad. They've traced it to there. But that's where the claim was first made that Adam's first wife was Lilith. And that's where everything sort of took a turn. Turned the page on a new bit of her evolution was with this treatise called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, S-I-R-A. And as I said, he wanted to work under the anonymity. Another author who was respected by the name of Ben Sira, who was a respected prophet and author of a couple of works called, one's the Book of Ben Sira and the other one's called the Ecclesiastica. But he especially wanted to hide behind someone because the book itself was more of a satire. It was a comedic look at a lot of the rabbis at the time. So a lot of his contemporaries were sort of roasted in this treatise. It was 22 different proverbs, and he's supposedly answering the questions of Nebuchadnezzar, the old Babylonian king, but questions that are really supposed to be comedic, funny, about why does a raven walk with a limp and an eagle is much more regal in his movements. And there's another story about how a fox outsmarted Leviathan to save his life. And so the humor is a bit sardonic, and it's sort of a bathroom humor, sort of a back room humor, I should say. So it was not well received at the time, but it had this one proverb about Lilith being the first wife of Adam. Now, why he put that in there, who knows? But many people probably, and just to illuminate on Ben Sira and just how respected he was, they feel that his book Ecclesiastica sort of helps date the book of Isaiah, actually, because in his book of Ecclesiastica he mentions Simon the Just, and most people agree, or some scholars agree, that Simon the Just likely lived around 200 BC, and his death likely was around 195, 96 BC, because there were discovery of the oldest book of Isaiah, I think at Qumran, the Dead Sea, that they carbon dated that scroll to 175 to 125 BC, which would completely be against what it had been thought that the book of Isaiah, the time of its writing, most people agree it was somewhere around 740 to 680 BC, somewhere in that time frame. Maybe, and many speculate that it was written over that time frame through the Babylonian exile in 3 different portions. I think you had the Proto, and then you had the Deutero and the Trito Isaiah, as they're called. But we were looking at, like, say, 740 to 680 BC, and then for these datings to come out, then they reference back to this Ecclesiastica for Ben Sira, and in many ways it helped to, I think, put away that argument, that claim that book of Isaiah was not written until, because that would change a lot of things, obviously. And another aspect of it is I think the Maccabean revolt was around 165, and if that were the case, then there were no mention of Maccabean revolt throughout Isaiah. Yeah, it was just not a contemporary happening at the time. And so in many ways, like I say, the Ben Sira got a bad rap, even being attached to this alphabet of Ben Sira. Muddies his name, so to speak. But that's where the wife legend came from, and then it also came sort of a legendary twist. It was a riddle of sorts, but as it was written in the alphabet, but says when Adam refused to yield to Lilith, and that in effect that Lilith, we'll get to this in a second too, it's kind of fascinating, that Lilith refused to be on the bottom during sex, that she wanted to be on top. That's the assertion it makes, and that's almost comedic. It sort of illuminates how comedic that satire was. But Adam refused to yield, then Lilith refused to yield, and then says that Lilith spoke the secret, ineffable, unutterable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, as it's known. It's interesting because it's believed that it kind of contradicts, because they think that the Tetragrammaton was Yahweh, and up until the 3rd century, that's only the 3rd century that they deemed it to be unutterable. So it kind of contradicts that whole notion that the Tetragrammaton at least, was that Yahweh name of God that she uttered. But it sprouted wings on her, and she was able to just leave Eden. Although other accounts have her as the last person in Eden. But that's another story altogether. But she left Eden, as the legend has it, as the alphabet has it. And then she abandoned paradise, and she went to the Red Sea, which was also a place at that time, as I mentioned back then, they had distrust of the wilderness and the ocean. The Red Sea, in many accounts, was seen as the edge of the world, that you go into the Red Sea, you're going to die as a human, that nothing but wild beasts and wild marine life lived there. But she went there, so that all added a bit of extra context to it, another layer to it, that she was able to function and be around the Red Sea, or to the Red Sea, and be fine. And then God sent 3 angels to intercede, to catch Lilith and try to talk her into coming back or reconsidering the declaration. I guess the declaration of the Tetragrammaton didn't completely banish her by itself. But so when God sent the 3 angels to bring her back, or to drag her back, the name of the angels were Sinoi, Sansinoi, and Samangaloth. And that'll be interesting in a minute as we get to it. But she apparently, as part of the alphabet, says she made a terrifying deal where she said, in exchange for the power to hunt human children, and she'll accept the daily death of 100 of her offspring. And so that's the deal she made, to remain in exile and have this power, which seems like and there is a bit of a later mention that maybe that power was due to the fact that she was unable to have the birth children. And some of that was the basis for her anger, for her desire to be out of paradise. So that's a whole other part of the story too. And to this day, it's interesting that it will show you these ancient amulets, along with those incantation bowls. They were found warding off Lilith, and all of them have the names of the 3 angels on the amulet specifically. And in many ways, it's still in practice today in modern day Jewish families, Jewish communities. They still have these amulets. They still have different practices to ward off Lilith. They actually call it, I was going to look at this word here because it's a tough one, Kimfartspedi. That's the name of it. Or they have the Shmira cards with the name of Sinoi, Sansinoi, and Samangaloth. And so women still traffic in these, in amulets especially, and the Shmira cards. And then there's also known as a bedtime Shema prayer, also to ward off Lilith, that they still utter to this day. So maybe it's just a bit of folklore that continues, but in some ways they feel like it's a must. They must. And it's a way to keep her at bay if you're a young man, because I mentioned she's known to visit young men, especially during the night, in a dark room, take their life force and use it. Known her being Lilith the succubus. But it's funny, when you look at that word succubus, it creates a whole interesting different set of discoveries. But when you look at the etymology of succubus, it's a Latin word that means to lie underneath, which is supposed to be one of her chief objections to Adam in the first place. She did not want to lie beneath, but as a succubus, the word means to lie beneath. And so that's an interesting contradiction, or maybe an interesting parallel to the original story of her as a wife, as now she's a succubus, lies underneath, or however she copulates with men in the night. And I said that it's often thought if a man had nighttime emissions, it could be he was visited by the succubus. And it leads to something else we'll get into when we'll develop that succubus a little bit more. And then as part of the myth, or the sort of the telephone that goes on through the centuries, but it's asserted that the actual word lullaby is connected to Lilith, and that the phrase Lilith Abi, it's what Jewish mothers would say to, or would sing to babies, meaning Lilith go away, or I think literally Lilith be gone. And so they've sung that over the last number of centuries, and somehow they believe that the words sort of got blurred over the centuries, and from one language to the next, maybe one dialect to the next, it sort of became or morphed into the English word lullaby. So this original Lilith Abi is now the lullaby that we sing to babies, and just to keep Lilith at bay. So, but now we're through the alphabet of Ben Sirah, which is sort of given Lilith sort of a whole new identity, and sort of set up her evolution even further to be appreciated, you might say, by some those who are looking for a female source of power, a female representation of power. And it really kicked things off further in about, we think, the 13th century Kabbalism, the Jewish mysticism practice. And it sort of took Lily's story out of folklore and it just elevated it and to what was really a cosmic nightmare. Because in the pages of the Zohar, which is considered the primary text among the 5 texts of Kabbalah, and she was crowned. She wasn't no longer just a runaway. She was crowned as the queen of the abyss alongside her husband, Samael. And if you know anything about the previous video on the Mark of Cain, I mentioned Samael. He's thought to have been the theory that of the serpent seed theory, that Samael became or shapeshifted into whatever the being was that tempted Eve. Some would say maybe that was just a seraphim, that maybe that's the way the being appeared, but some think Samael, and it's asserted also, I'll get into a little bit, that Samael was impotent, that he, in his form that he walks around in, he's impotent, or he was castrated in a judgment. And so he's pretty mad too about losing his his manhood. And so he carries that out in revenge throughout the centuries. But he unites with Lilith. They become a sort of a dark power couple in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar. And Samael is also known as the supreme angel of poison, of death, and really Satan's sort of primary persona. So this is really a match made, not necessarily in heaven, but as the Kabbalah would assert, it's a different side of heaven, because they believe in what's called the good side, the right side, and the unholy left side. And that's where Samael and Lilith reign together. And it's sort of the balance between light and dark. It's a fragile balance, but they're over here taking care of the death and the dark portion, and then we have the other manifestations of God that are good, that are holy. They're taking care of this is the way that Kabbalism describes things. And they go into great detail in attempts to describe the nature of evil, where evil came from, and they really take Lilith and ascribe a lot of the creation of evil to Lilith, that she was very much an agent of evil throughout the centuries. And I think they're going back and they're looking to Babylonian times, as I said, 13th century, and they call it the Sitra Achra, which is considered that left side. It's the Kabbalah term. The Zohar it's sort of, they look to expand on the Torah. It's a multi-volume commentary on the Torah, the Pentateuch. And they really, like I said, they think that Lilith, there are 5 different manifestations that they highlight in the Zohar of Lilith. And they say she's a beautiful woman, red-headed, beautiful white skin, pearl skin, but beautiful torso, body, but from the waist down, she's fire, complete fire. So you're not getting anywhere near her. And she, as we mentioned before, she was already a scorned woman of sorts, because she was unable to marry or unable to have children. But with fire going on, you're not going to get anywhere near Lilith in this representation. But there are 5 different ones, and they say that one of them, they called the elder lily, fights another younger lily or lesser lily in the desert every year on Yom Kippur. So they just go at it. They're fighting on Yom Kippur. This is the sustained legend throughout all these years since the 13th century, to be a thought within Kabbalism even to this day that's going on. And so, as I mentioned about the succubus just a second ago, that means to lie beneath, and they believe in the Zohar that a way in which demons sort of translate themselves to a higher existence is they go from what they call succubus to incubus. I remember that band called Incubus, but never knew I don't know if they were looking at this when they formulated that name. Maybe they were. But incubus means to lie on top. So they become from a lying on the bottom, force a demon, to a lying on the top. I guess it's a lot better life on the top. But they do that when they lie with humans, and maybe they have to generate enough life force to be able to make the jump, the transition. And once they become an incubus, they have a lot more, I think, say and power over their existence. But interesting. And they say that God actually in Kabbalah, it's in Kabbalism, God has they say a female aspect. It's called the Shekinah. And it represents, the female is really countered by Lilith on that side of God, the female side, which on the Shekinah side is supposed to be the holy, the good side of God in the female aspect. The bad side or the evil side is countered by the Lilith. So they perpetuate Lilith being very much an important figure in everyday fight between good and evil. Lilith, she's the queen of the abyss, the demons, ruling over them, and she's sort of ruling over the dark realm with Samael, and then she's also sort of countering the Shekinah. And so she continues to be a source, they say, of impurity, temptations, and a destructive nature, just stealing life, even to this day, of course. And it's mystics believe that Lilith wandered the world at night, and the Zohar sort of continues that thought that she's a night demon, just like back from the Babylonian times, that she's out stealing life force at night from men. And they even have different, throughout Jewish lore, they believe that if you're going to sleep at night, you don't want to be in a dark room, you want a candle or something lit to keep Lilith at bay. And you don't want to have to, you also want to keep your limbs and all covered. But you got to be in a semi-lit room to keep Lilith at bay, because she'll breed millions of invisible imps. But it's interesting that she continues to be a succubus. I guess I don't know if she's enabled to make that transition to an incubus. Maybe I have to look into that a little bit further. But the Cabal is the Kabbalism's some pretty wild stuff going on there. And then as we look at even further, as Lilith sort of developed and evolved through Kabbalism, I think it gave her some new cachet. She became even more of a hot item, or we got a lot more from that was taken from these texts, the Zohar mainly, that she's very much a real creation. She's a real being that's still exerting effect, and then things were interesting in that we look at some of the representations that have been painted. We look at during the Renaissance, Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, and they think is about 1512, I think. One of his greatest paintings, it's a fresco on the wall of the Sistine Chapel, but it's called The Temptation Expulsion of Adam and Eve, where he represents the serpent with the torso and the face of a woman. And many believe that was Lilith, that Michelangelo painted Lilith in this representation. It's right there on the Sistine Chapel, that she was able to disguise herself and shapeshift, just as Samael can, into a half serpent. And that she was, as legend has it, is from the Zohar, they believe that when she did go into Eden and she was able to shapeshift, that she was able to infiltrate Eden through this morph state she was in and speak to Eve. And then we'll get into later on what people think that conversation was about. But it wasn't just a random snake in Michelangelo's painting. They think it was Lilith returning to Eden to destroy Eve out of vengeance. But we'll see that also morphs and evolves into modern day. So in many ways, Kabbalism, they took the depiction, creating the alphabet, and they just ran with it. They gave it great credence. And they gave credence to the idea, even more so, that Lilith was Adam's first wife, that narrative has, that it will travel, that will continue to be spoken of even to this day. Many believe that. And then credit Kabbalism a lot for the advancement of Lilith when you look back on it. The alphabet of Ben Sirah was a big step forward. It really sort of, as I said, initiated the idea of his first wife, but Kabbalah just took Lilith to another level. And they were kind of getting to another level, as we'll see in modern times. And we're going to get to new heights, and it kind of all spawned again in the 1970s, that Lilith kind of started to take on even new nature and new representation and kind of new status as a feminist symbol. That in the 70s, when a social revolution was going on, that women were seeking, of course, the systemic equality, and theologians and writers, they began combing through history, really looking for any representations of this Adam's first wife figure. And then there was an Israeli Israeli-American journalist. Her name actually was Lily. Figure that. Lily Rivlin. She published an article in Mrs. Magazine, or Miss Magazine. And for the first time really in modern print, and she argued that Lilith shouldn't be feared as a demon, but she should be vindicated as history's first feminist. And that's kind of what's launched into what many consider Lilith to be today. That took another step in the evolution, and another conversation in the telephone game throughout the centuries. Lilith now is sort of revered as a feminist symbol of strength, of feminine strength, and sort of a defiance, of course, of the patriarchy that's the feminists would believe that's been in place, and a defiance of her husband, of course, all the way back to Adam. So that defiance kind of really vindicated Lilith, and especially. And there was another painting we'll have here. I'll show that up here. In 1892, a painter by the name of John Collier depicted Lilith as a beautiful woman, and she has a boa constrictor wrapped around her. It's a pretty simple looking painting, and it's kind of a defining painting though of Lilith's powers, that she has this snake at her will, and she's also connected to a tree. Maybe that tree was the tree of life, I don't know. And I'll have to look a little bit at John Collier's painting, but in many ways that sort of furthered, and I think led to, especially in the Miss Magazine article, that was a painting that she continued with the magazine. And then there's been a kind of a shift, even to this day, you'd have to say, that there was another woman who was a journalist named Susan Weidman Schneider, and she officially founded what was a Lilith magazine off the heels in 1976 of the Miss Magazine article. But she had the bold tagline of independent, Jewish, and frankly feminist. And she was using Lilith as a representation of all that she was the harbinger of things to come when it came to evolution of feminist thought and feminist placement within society, things moving forward in terms of equality. But she even says that her rebellion in Eden was not a sin, it was a righteous refusal to accept domestic submission. So that created a whole new outlook, a new kind of turned the page on Lilith, and a woman by the name of Judith Plaskow, and she also wrote something called The Coming of Lilith. But she retells the entire Lilith story, and this is a big advancement, I think, because in retelling the story, it's kind of become dogma of sorts. And she tells it that Lilith did return to Eden after being in the Red Sea with the three angels. She came back, and she was not a vengeful snake when she came back, but she went back to friend Eve. That the two women were able to talk, they were able to kind of share their stories, and then form a powerful sisterhood between the two of them. So it just completely upends the patriarchal narrative that pits them against one another, she says. And then that put a whole new spin on, and I think many people sort of ran with that retelling, that there's a lot of credence to it, but in many ways. And then in 1990s, we had something called Lilith Fair, I don't know if you remember, but there's a concert series by all women musicians. Sarah McLachlan was the lead. I think she was the organizer of the event, but I think it was the years 97, 98, 99 with a lot of concert dates, maybe 50 concert dates in those years each, and raised estimates of $50 to $60 million. So it was more glorification of Lilith. And then we get to today. I know I heard this recently. I think that Lilith at one time, maybe around 2010, was maybe the 100th most used name for babies, for baby girls. It's climbed, I think, in the top 15 now. So there continues to be this fascination, reverence for Lilith. The name, it's become more accepted. It doesn't have a negative connotation, obviously. In many ways has a connotation of maybe power, strength in a woman. And I looked up some other things that were surprising, just where Lilith is in current culture. But there's a massive blockbuster video game I knew nothing about called Diablo 4. She's reimagined as the Blessed Mother in that video game. So she's taken another sort of step as coming from an stealer of life and killer of children. Now she's a Blessed Mother, kind of an architect of humanity, in fact, in the video game. And she fiercely protects her children, and she's protecting them from the wars of angels and demons. So she's a protective force, even in the supernatural, unseen realm. That's what she's doing out there. And that kind of gets us to where we are now. It's amazing. I don't know if you'll agree now, looking back on it, as I stated, it's kind of an amazing transformation over the centuries. A bit of a telephone aspect to it, so leaving behind maybe some of her previous depiction, what was thought to be her nature, the orientation of her nature. But now, as we see where she is now, she's come a long way as Lilith. And so in our modern world, she's kind of an emblem, even now, you'd say, of global emblem of raw power, independence, and spirit. And that's it. That takes us through all a look at Lilith. I think for me, it was very illuminating, hopefully for you too. And maybe to look into her a little bit further, but it's difficult in many cases to find a lot of information. I think that the Zohar was the most rich source of information I was able to find, and you have to glean through quite a bit there. But the Zohar is actually probably the biggest springboard for Lilith into where she sits today. So sort of an international icon of independence. And it just kind of proves one of the oldest myths the oldest myth maybe, as you would say, it's the oldest mythological figures that's not fading away by any means. In fact, she's probably growing and becoming more preeminent by the day. So that's it. Thanks for tuning in, and please subscribe to Supernatural History. That'll help out a great deal. I'm just getting things going here. So we have some tremendous topics upcoming. I think the next one I'm going to do on something that's fascinated me for a long time, since I can remember. It's a verse out of Revelation 17 where it says that when the beast is the ruler, that the other 10 sub-rulers, they will all be of one mind. So that's fascinated me for years. I've never really, so I'm trying to put my finger on that. I'm researching that now, but that's going to be, the next video is going to be about the hive mind. So, and you can sort of ascribe that mentality to a lot of different things that have happened throughout history. When a hive mind took place, or residence in a certain place. I think there was one thing I looked up, there was a dancing hive mind that took place where people danced until they literally could not stand, almost danced themselves to death. So we'll sort of trace the genealogy of the hive mind and where it is today and how it's sort of influencing and how it may potentially influence us in the future, because it says also in the Bible that many will be deceived, and even the elect, if not for God. But I think that is a lot of hive mind mechanics right there, when everyone's going to be deceived. This hive mind is going to be powerful. I think it's only going to grow. Some people attribute AI in many ways to being the birth of this hive mind in actuality in today's times. So let's look into it. Tune in to the next one. Thanks for tuning in to this one. I hope you learned a lot. Leave me some comments, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.